Welcome to Sounds of Resistance channel. The negativities of the Ukraine-Russia war affected the Russian people the most, especially in the last stages of the war. Russian citizens who woke up with nightmares every morning became afraid to turn on their televisions. The miraculous examples of struggle carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces left both the Russian army and the Russian administration helpless. While Russian leader Vladimir Putin said on the first day of the war that the siege of Kiev would not last even 2 hours, he is now stuck in the spacious rooms of the Kremlin. The Russian leader, whose every solution proposal turned into a diplomatic scandal, tried many ways to extinguish this fire of reaction against him. To cover up the loss of nearly 60,000 soldiers of the Russian army, Putin primarily used the Russian media. He had Russian channels broadcast political propaganda content, stating that everything was very good. Thus, Vladimir Putin, who thought that he could deceive his people, sought a solution later in gang organizations. It was claimed that the Russian army had nearly 60,000 dead soldiers and almost 3 times more wounded. In other words, approximately 200,000 Russian soldiers were neutralized. He had to somehow make up for this loss in the army. This was a serious number. No citizen of any country will let a significant part of his army be dissolved in a war. Regardless of the consequences, the rebellion begins. The expected happened in Russia, and the Russian people said, "Enough is enough" to this trend. Tens of thousands of anti-war Russian citizens took the streets every day. The Russian people, who continued their actions for a long time, faced an obstacle placed by their leaders. The Kremlin administration and the Russian leader Vladimir Putin have detained their own citizens who protested against the war for expressing their free will. The last point where the Russian leader cut his ties with the people is the mobilization decision he announced the other day. This radical decision made by Putin, which shook the world agenda, was enough to prepare the end of its citizens in his country. When the decision to mobilize, which would destroy the order in Russia and destroy the trust between the administration and the people, spilled from Putin's lips on Wednesday morning, the whole country went dark in the morning light. There was dead silence in Russia for a long time that morning, when the words expressed by the Russian defense minister dealt a blow to the Russian people. Russian Defense Shoigu stated that 1 million more Russian soldiers will be sent to Ukraine and that 300,000 Russian citizens should urgently join the army in order to supply this number. Immediately after the statement, the Russians began preparations for escape. The escape marathon of more than 500,000 Russian citizens had already begun. The Russian people, who did not want to lose their lives for the sake of an aimless occupation, hastily prepared their suitcases and set out on the road. Russian airline companies consumed all the tickets they had in one day. It's time for the Russians to travel. There were 3 important routes at the destination. Russian citizens can enter without a visa: Turkey, Armenia, and Georgia. Russian citizens, especially the male population, who took their families with them and managed to flee the country, sought to establish a new order instead of fighting in Ukraine. Queues formed at the border gate for 15 kilometers. Since the mobilization speculations began this past weekend, Russian men had begun to flee Russia. From last Sunday to Friday, approximately 573,000 Russian civilians fled to Georgia, Armenia, and Turkey. There were also those who took refuge in Finland, Germany, and the UK. The Russians were offered certain conditions by the countries from which they fled. Georgia is the country most preferred by Russian citizens who escaped the wrath of Vladimir Putin. Russian citizens who left their country and crossed the Georgian border are also in for a surprise here. The reputation of Putin's occupying policies has long exceeded Georgia's borders. In a bar located in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, an application that stunned those who heard it started. The Dadiana bar in Tbilisi, which accepts those who flee from Russia on one condition, has Russian guests sign a form without letting them in. The items in the form are quite remarkable. Some of the articles in this form, which were created as a reaction to the oppressive occupation policies implemented by the Russian administration. I didn't vote for Putin because he's a dictator. Crimea belongs to Ukraine, which is the most crucial item. Other occupied, disputed territories also belong to Ukraine. I condemn Russia's aggressive attitude towards Ukraine. Russian citizens have to fill out this form in order to enter. The owner of the place does not want to serve a person inside who supports Putin and justifies his hate policies. While the Russian administration has made itself famous around the world, a solution that can replace the losses in the Russian army has still not been found. The situation of the Russians leaving the country, which left the Kremlin helpless, made the citizens staying in Russia a target. Russian leader Putin's crazy search for soldiers also makes the citizens in Russia very uneasy. Citizens who free themselves from Russia now say that when they look back, they see a country under fire. The current situation in Russia is exactly as the fleeing citizens say. A similar situation occurred in the early days of the Ukraine-Russia war, the first days of Russian leader Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine. Desperately bombarding the residential areas of the civilian population, the Russians forced millions of Ukrainian citizens to leave their homes and become refugees. Security centers defined as humanitarian corridors were created for innocent Ukrainian civilians trying to save their lives. However, the Russian army under the leadership of the Russian leader did not hesitate to attack even this humanitarian corridor. Remember, during the third round of negotiations, the Russians rained bullets on the convoy of Ukrainian citizens who were evacuated from the city of Sumy and set out for Poltava. 11 Ukrainian civilians were killed. Now the Russian leader, abandoned by his own citizens, is trying to find pounds to send toward Ukraine. After Putin's mobilization decision, Russia wakes up with a different event every day. 2 days ago, at the same time intervals, Russian military and government buildings were engulfed in flames. Public buildings where the fire broke out received serious damage. The cause of the fires is the same. Government buildings and military registration stations, which were set on fire using Molotov cocktails at night, are thought to have been set on fire by the Russian people as a reaction. While the fires that broke out at night in Russia are considered as the harbinger of a total popular uprising, the concerns of the Russian administration on this issue are at the highest level. Thousands of Russian citizens who participated in the protests are currently still in police custody. Their fate is not bright at all. Vladimir Putin stated that there would be serious criminal sanctions against the citizens who participated in anti-war actions. Even the Ukrainian government showed mercy to the Russians, and their own administrations did not even look at them. All these hate policies implemented by the Russian administration over time turned the relationship between the people and the administration upside down. 90% of the Russian people are now fed up with Putin and his administration. The seat of the Russian leader is in danger. Events in Russia are seriously out of control. Although the Kremlin administration tries to make the chaos environment in Russia look good, the progress is estimated as the equivalent of hell on earth for the Russians. Russia had not faced such a large internal revolt in a long time. The Russian administration was in a position to declare mobilization for the first time since World War II. The head of the Ukrainian giants, Zelensky, warned the Russians about mobilization. Ukrainian leader Zelensky urged the Russians not to stop fighting their own leaders. Considering the leaders of both countries, it is noteworthy that Zelensky, on the one hand, still thinks about the well-being of Russian civilian citizens despite being at war. On the other hand, it does not surprise anyone that Russian leader Putin paved the way for prison sentences for his citizens who participated and organized the anti-war protest and wanted to send his people to die in Ukraine by force. Because the Russian leader has left his mark on many war crimes and human rights violations to achieve victory since the beginning of the war. At the moment, the Russian leader Putin seems to be sitting in his chair and waiting for the end. Follow us to get news of developments. Thanks for watching.